Welcome. Today we are going to address pietism. It's a topic that I'm really excited about addressing because it's something that I've spent a lot of time addressing. I even have a book about pietism and the foundations of the modern world available wherever books are sold. Right now, this is one of those fun things that I've got a lot of information and time that I have spent on this topic, and I hope that you find it engaging as well. When you hear pietism, you just saw me hold up a book with it on the title, and you could do a quick search of it and see that there's many others out there. But what does it mean? Some of your first inclinations might be the word pious, and after all, pietism does derive its name from a work called Pious Wishes, Pia Desideria, and we'll briefly touch on that later. So there is some notion of piety to it. Still, some students just hear pie and not piety. Your thoughts are, pie, good stuff. Or, okay, more monks. We kind of been doing some monks recently. Are there monks here? Can there be monks here? The answer is no, but you're not so far off if this was your thought. Some of you are thinking, okay, what, those angry street corner preachers instead, calling you to repent and speaking about you going to hell and all those other big things. And the answer is, you're not entirely wrong either, but you're not entirely right. That's not the point of all of this. Still, some of you are like, I don't know. This is not something I've got an opinion on. I don't have any thoughts about it yet. It's not a topic that I feel as comfortable with as maybe some of the other ones. Maybe my thoughts, the holier than thou thing, maybe that's what attaches to it. And there's some connection with that in the whole street corner preacher. Maybe it's not somebody standing, on the corner yelling, but somebody who just thinks they're better than everybody else? Or is it something otherworldly? Is it, something beyond this, right? Is it sort of putting its attention elsewhere instead of here in this life? All of these are not terrible. I mean, the pie thing and the I don't know thing aren't great, but there's elements of understanding of where we'd like to go. If your thoughts were more towards piety or put on or something, piety, then that's okay. That's not too bad, and good job on you. In many ways, we've already kind of laid the foundation a little bit to understand Protestant experiential Christianity and its attempts at overcoming the passions. We've seen this in our discussion of medieval Catholic asceticism, with our discussion of Foligno, Tauler, and Akempis, because the things that we talked about with them apply as well to our pietist counterparts. But the world is seen differently from the Catholic versus Protestant lens. Once we start looking at the same idea from a Protestant perspective, we lose the weight and import of the ecclesial structure of the church itself in large measure. And sometimes we even lose the value of the sacraments, depending on who we are talking about within the Protestant worldview. Pietism is a little more difficult because it's mystically oriented and emphasizes genuine experience of the divine, but the way that many did it before under the Catholic milieu was by being monastics and retreating from the world. Now, you can't do that if there's no monasticism. And again, we don't want to equate all monastics and mystics together. Those aren't one and the same. But it's a lot easier to do it under one guise than it is another. So we're left again with trying to wonder, who are the pietists? In many ways, you're already more familiar with this group than you know. Pietism is the name for the movement on the European continent, and they have another name when they are in England. They are known by Puritans. Really connecting these terms and seeing Puritanism as the English equivalent of Pietism and really having the same source and movement is a discussion of recent scholarship. For a while, Pietists were limited to those Lutherans that emerged after Spener, but the recent trend in scholarship is to look at this movement as one of the main strands that exist in Protestantism broadly and incorporates differing expressions of Pietism, both including the notions of Reform and Anglicanism with in the Lutheran trend as well. And the person whose work kind of led to this new way of addressing scholarship is a man by the name of Ernst Stoffler, and his work was called The Rise of Evangelical Pietism. Traditionally, Pietism was understood as a revival movement in the age of absolutism, and kind of a pushback against both the absolutist state and the tenets of Enlightenment thought. But most scholarship today wouldn't say that. Most scholarship is not looking at Pietism as a revivalist movement, but a trend and an aspect that exists within Protestantism more broadly. Some scholars will even approach Pietism as the actual cause of the Enlightenment, and not a reaction to the Enlightenment ideas and the absolutist state. And we can always look at Pietism as that movement which spurs on many other movements throughout the 18th and 19th century, including the rise of fundamentalism, Pentecostalism in the 20th century, the holiness movement throughout the 19th century in America and abroad, theological liberalism, evangelicalism, and even some arguments can be made about the different Great Awakenings in the United States and their relation to Pietism as well. Now, to give full disclosure about this is a subject that I can kind of geek out for a little while on. I do have a book on Pietism and the foundations of the modern world available wherever books are sold. This does allow for a little enthusiasm on my behalf, but it also does provide with some difficulty, as I'm going to just do what I can talk about a lot more briefly, and might be missing out on some questions or concerns that you might have on the subject, because it's already something that I've wrestled with, moved on, and kind of jumped on right past. But you, my audience, does get the benefit of hearing a little gleanings from one of the things that I've spent a lot of my time and research in. So there is that advantage as well. Since I mentioned that Pietism is kind of a new and contested term, how do I define it? Now, it's really not an easy term to define, because there's a lot of different strands that you'd probably want to pull and try to apply it to. My broad definition of Pietism is that it's a quasi-mystical experiential revivalist movement found within Lutheran, Reform, and Anglican Protestantism of every age, which seeks to understand and rework their world, both inside and out of themselves, along the lines of personally meaningful relationships between themselves as individuals and God, while maintaining a general antipathy or outright hostility to the greater Christian culture and religious formalism, which dictates that culture's norms and practices. We could actually spend a lot of time going through this definition and why it is that I include so many different little kind of caveats and points to it. It's important, following Stoffler's work, that I'm addressing Lutheran, Reform, and Anglican Protestantism. And it is an experiential revivalist movement in a classic sense, as a lot of Protestantism is itself an attempt at being a revivalist movement. And it's also something that we see from the very beginning of Protestantism, the very beginning of the times of the Reformations. It's not something that just comes about later. It's not just the product of one person's work, and yet it's also an attitude and a relation to the broader Christian world and the communities that they find themselves in. And so all of these need to be included to one extent or another. A more simple definition of Pietism is also probably beneficial. Pietism are those Protestants who emphasize, if we want to bring this to the present, experience over the other two strains that we would see within Protestant thought, notions of rationalism and scholasticism. Scholasticism usually took the form of confessional identity, and rationalism was trying to understand the world broader than we would see within the scholastic theological trends of the day. And we have different regions where we might say that one of these is emphasized a little bit more. confessional identity is really a topic that is much more important in the Holy Roman Empire, especially when we've got discussions of, are you going to be Lutheran or Reform, and those debates there. It's not quite as strong as it is in England, and the trend towards rationalism is a little bit stronger in England, and yet we also, in all of these places, have this strand of Protestants who say that rationalism and scholasticism are not really the point of religion at all. It's not the point of Christianity. It's not the point of Protestantism, but rather experience of the divine is. And so these three strands exist, and there's been different work in scholarship that have emphasized the relationship of Protestantism to rationalism, or Protestantism and confessional identity, and the formation of confessional identity, and whole works have been dedicated to just those. It's only fairly recently that works are being dedicated to that group of people that looked at experience as the quintessential idea and demoted, in their eyes, rationalism and scholasticism. Now, we should not ever say that these three different strands are things that are isolated and cut off from one another. The scholastic is usually engaged in rational thoughts and rationalism to some extent, and also talking about religion being something that's experienced, as the rationalist also wants to talk about confessional identity and also experience. But it's really about the emphasis and who's doing so and what does this mean moving forward. We've also already experienced some discussion of pietism. Max Weber in his life had pietist upbringings, had connections to pietism, as many thinkers will. He also had connections to Calvinism. And again, there's overlap between these two groups. And he speaks of pietism in his work as well, and says that it arrives at the same spirit of capitalism, but from a different sort of point and perspective than Calvinism would. Weber is definitely of that older school of thought that looks at pietism as really rejecting the mind and only going with this sort of emotionalism. Weber really identifies pietism with this emphasis on emotion that he says is not as present within other forms as well. But again, this is an older view and his interpretation of it, and far be it from me to criticize Weber too much. But the real emphasis of pietism is about your experience. Emotionalism is only used as a service for experience and experiencing the divine. The idea is that you're going to be separated from the rest of the congregation, which is important for pietists and this general antipathy to the broader world. But what's separating you is not the fact that you only care about an emotional response, but that you're seeking after an experience of the divine, and not just head knowledge or confirmation that you might be one of the elect through some sort of rational proof. In fact, for the pietist, rational proofs aren't going to tell you that you are the elect. How do you know that you have a relationship with God? Because you experience a relationship with God. It's not about facts, it's about what you go through. While the Calvinist wants to reassure themselves that they are the elect, the pietist already knows that they are the elect. They have this dependency upon God that rejects all of these stern understandings, and therefore are able to proceed. In many ways, this is the reading that Weber will have upon it as well, but adding a little bit more emphasis on emotionalism than I think is appropriate. Ultimately, the point in the Protestant ethic and for Weber is that Calvinism wants to relate more with that hard legalism of capitalism, while pietism may appeal to those who would desire leisure, but reinforce reasons to do their labor. And his reason for addressing pietism at all is to address the different characters of the people who would fall under one influence of one of these more ascetical movements as opposed to one of the other worldly ascetical movement. But the point of this discussion is not to reiterate Weber and his notion of the spirit of capitalism and where it comes from, either Calvinism or Lutheranism or Pietism or any of these other groups, but is to try to understand different takeaways, different things that we could learn from the Pietists and helping us overcome the passions in our own life. There are several different Pietists that we could point our attention to and follow examples or a handful of takeaways from them. Specifically, though, we are going to look at 5 Pietist leaders: William Perkins, Johan Arndt, Philipp Jakob Spener, August Hermann Francke, Nicholas Ludwig von Ziesendorf. These 5, along with Wesley, are included in my work, Pietism and the Foundations of the Modern World. And if you were to investigate more of their life, you'd have other things as well. But broadly speaking, I'm just trying to get a handful of little nuggets that you're able to take away and ways of reapproaching the passions in your own life. For this, we will draw some conclusions from them. From Perkins, we'll understand that style matters. For Arndt, it's about your heart. And for Spener, it's about groups of people around you, small groups that can live life with you. For Francke, it's about the industriousness. There's a few other things that we will add in for each of these, but industriousness is really the term that identifies Francke more than most. And for Count Nicholas Ludwig von Ziesendorf, it'll be notions of being consistent, which he did most of his life. The first of these 5 men that we are going to talk about is William Perkins, 1558 to 1602. Scholars describe him as the principal architect of Elizabethan Puritanism, the Puritan theologian of Tudor times, the most important Puritan writer, the prince of Puritan theologians, and the father of Puritanism. And in many ways, these statements are perfectly apt and accurate. In 1591, Perkins wrote what many believe to be his major work, A Golden Chain. It is this work that will win the day at the Synod of Dort and is primarily a criticism against Arminius and his ideology. The notions of tulip that we get of 5-point Calvinism is really derived from Perkins and his work. When we read the Golden Chain, we see that the first link in this chain, the golden chain of our salvation, as it were, is man's predestination, or your calling. And in many ways, these are one and the same. From here, the 3 remaining steps are your justification, sanctification, and glorification. And while this is Perkins' major work, and we shouldn't ignore it, it's not really what we're going to talk about today. Perkins also focused quite a bit on the art of preaching. In his work that he called The Art of Prophesying, it's really meaning preaching, not foretelling the future, we're able to learn that Perkins cares not just about the substance of the message, but the style of it as well. He began his career as a preacher, preaching to prisoners. And it was said that Perkins could pronounce the word damn with such an emphasis as it left a doleful echo in the ears of those present for a good while afterwards. When he says something, he's expecting his audience to hear it. He's expecting that there's going to be some meaning for it and that it will resonate in your ears. In a much more modern way of looking at it, we need to understand that we're selling the sizzle, not just the steak. Why is it that you go to a restaurant? You don't go to a restaurant for the food. I mean, that's part of why you go there, sure. But you go there for the sizzle, not the steak. You go there for the experience, not simply the fact that you need food. In most cases, not in all, but in a good many of them, you could get equivalent food from a store and make it at yourself and save yourself a good amount of money. So why are you spending more money to go out? Ease is part of it, but ease can only explain so much, especially if you're cash-strapped, as many college students are. Sometimes the quality is a little bit better. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's worse. You go out to a restaurant because of the experience of the restaurant, of the buzz around you, the sizzling of the food, the fact that you're just sitting there and you're able to carry on conversations with other people and engage in life, and boom, there's your food. What an event. Nothing else required, right? The sizzle itself is there, and the same thing Perkins says matters when we're talking about things far more significant than what you're eating today. For Perkins, style matters. And you know style matters. Why is it you spent so long picking out the clothes that you did today? Or buying them from the store? Why one thing instead of another? Because you think your personal style matters. Some of you don't, and we know who you are. It's okay. But for the majority of people, there's at least some thought of you're wanting things to look good. Regardless of what's underneath, you're wanting the appearance of it to matter. And for Perkins, in the art of prophesying, God's word is important. It's what he made his livelihood around. It's what he engaged in life with. Appearance matters to Perkins. Appearance is the reason why he turned his life around. In his early life, he was a bit of a drunkard, so the story goes. At one point, there was a child acting up across the street, and the mother turned to this child and said, "You better act up right, otherwise I'm going to send you off to be in the care of yonder Perkins over there." The fact that he was being used as a threat kind of shook him. This is how people see me? I'm looked at the, "You better act up straight, otherwise you're going to be stuck with this guy"? And he probably embellished some of this as well, as a good performer would. But, right, this is what he's going to say, that ultimately there's probably some hint of truth to that. And he was wanting to proceed moving forward. He's wanting there to be some pizzazz, something that's attractive to what he believes is absolutely essential. And so if you've got things in your life that matter, make sure that it looks like it matters. Make sure that people can hear the sizzle and are drawn to it. And that it's not just what you can get anywhere else. The next person we'll put our attention towards is Johan Arndt, 1555 to 1621. He's often identified as the grandfather of Pietism, for those that believe that Pietism had its beginning following the 30 Years' War, that older view. And even for that older view, Arndt was always in the mix, always in the running, as an example of Pietism before Pietism. More the modern view is that he's in that continuity with other pietists from the very beginning. His major work was published in 1606, and it was called True Christianity. True Christianity becomes the modern devotional work that is wildly popular throughout the Protestant world, throughout the 17th century, and even, some extent, through into the 19th century. The focus of this work is on the atonement and its impact upon the heart of the believer. It's not just about what difference the atonement makes for you eternally, or how this fits in on your golden chain to salvation, as Perkins would have addressed. But for Arndt, it's about what that means for you personally, his audience, who were widely Lutherans. Arndt believes that true Christianity involves a union with Christ that reaches a true transformation that can only take place after you open your heart to God. We've talked about the idea of your heart and making sure your heart is in it already in this class and connecting it with different thoughts. But for Arndt, this is the central message. He wants to ask you, what impact does your heart have on what you do and on who you are and who you spend your time with? How do the people around you impact who you are and your heart? If they were to look in on your heart, would they find it edifying and beneficial? How often do you stop and ask yourself, how's your heart? Why is it that you're happy or sad or miserable or angry or content? It's where your heart is. What happens when you stub your toe or get your foot stepped on? How is it you react? Largely, Arndt would say, it's a reaction to the condition of your heart and where you're going to move from that point forward. The true aim is a experience of God, not just merging yourself with God. This is not Catholic mysticism. There is a difference of what Arndt is proposing from these earlier Catholic mystics, although he did draw heavily upon a Kempis Tauler and Angela Foligno. There is also some overlap into some of the notions that we'll get into with antinomianism next time. This work was extremely popular, but it challenged, only in small measures, the traditional Lutheran orthodoxy. Different histories can be written about that discussion, but for right now, the point is, how's your heart? How often do you stop and think about your heart health, as it were? Not in the beating, but in the way you construct yourself and what makes it the way that it is. You need to once again go back and find the root of the problem, as a Kempis was arguing, and understand what you need to do moving forward and proceeding. That if your heart isn't right, then the rest of your life, it doesn't matter what else you do and what techniques you add, isn't going to benefit you any. The traditional founder of Pietism is Philipp Jakob Spener, 1635 to 1705. In many ways, Spener, a man of his young 30s, ended up getting his dream job. He became the chief pastor in Frankfurt, the chief Protestant city of Germany. This is what he got in 1666, and we should imagine that it was literally everything he ever dreamed of. As a preacher, to get called to the biggest chair in the biggest city is an amazing task. And he took this job very seriously. He saw that everyone else was going to look in at him and what he was doing and evaluate not only how competent he was, but the religion that he cared about. Is Lutheranism for real? Is it as good as Calvinism, for instance, was part of that debate in causing real reform for the people? He had probably some notions of anxiety and probably some enthusiasm all the same. Spener wanted to make sure that Frankfurt was fantastic. So what did he do? Early on, he attempted to physically reform the society by actions such as eliminating trade on Sundays and curbing ostentatious attire. These actions were not unheard of, but they were met with rather poor results. Spener spent probably way too long arguing with the city council and trying to force these changes and didn't have that happen the way that he envisioned. He thought, hey, I'm here. I've done everything I need to do. Why is it I am not proceeding any farther? What happens to you when you try to force something to work and it's not going? You realize that you're a square peg and you need to be a round hole. That what you thought you were prepared for, you're not prepared for. And it's not happening the way that you want it to. How do you adapt to the challenges that you face when you don't get the results that you want? Do you just muscle it in and just kind of, I'm going to get this to work and fight it? Or do you adapt? And what does that adapting look like? Notice here the similarities that we've had with earlier discussions with Stoicism and also with cynicism, especially Tellus in his discussion of how you're supposed to adapt to all the changes of life. right? That the sailor doesn't complain about the wind, he adapts and moves forward. That we need to adapt to the circumstances as they are. It took Spener a little while to realize how to adapt. He'll spend the next 3 or so years shifting his understanding of religion from a top-down model to one that increasingly focused on the laity. That the conflict with the city governance wasn't going to get him what he wanted. And he also continued to grow a friendship that he had with Leibniz. Those of you unfamiliar with Leibniz, amongst being the greatest philosopher of this age, of this century, usually identified as such, also a famed diplomat and founder of calculus. And Leibniz was indeed a very wise man and a friend of Spener, and he encouraged Spener to rebuild his shattered structure. Spener ends up creating what's known as the Collegia Pietas, a lay group that focused on holy living. In fact, the name of Pietism derives from this collegia, this group of pietas, right? This group of people, and his other work that he will publish, Pia Desideria, or pious wishes. And in many ways, this outlines many of his principal ideas of what we would see within Pietism, especially the Lutheran post-Spener versions of it. And what did we learn? Spener learned that he had greater success working from the bottom up than he ever got from the top down. That working with other people was far more beneficial than him simply forcing something that wasn't going to work the most time that he was going to spend forcing it. Spener would encourage us to stop and ask about how much of our own success in our life is as a result of the people who share your goals and work alongside you in getting this goal done. Now, we've already talked about the idea of mentors and confessors and authorities who can help push and urge your life moving forward. We saw this within Hesychism as well as other philosophies. But Spener wants to point out that we need to also have peers who work alongside us. That it's not just somebody else who's wiser who can tell us what to do, but doing life with other people, with a small group of those who are concerned with you, can help lead you to great success. This is the success that Spener had in Frankfurt, and in 1694 it led to another key event in his life, the contributions that he led to the founding of the University of Halle in Prussia. One of the people that Spener would take with him to Halle is a man by the name of August Hermann Francke. Francke, by the way, was doing many of the same small group ideas that Spener was even before he encountered Spener, and these become kind of a nice synthesis of ideas. And Francke really becomes the one who's in charge of the theology program at the university in Halle. He was also, unfortunately, though, given the unenviable task of trying to fix part of the town. The slums, known as Glaucha. So, what do you do when you're surrounded by garbage? What do you do when everything around you is in a state of disrepair and ugly and kind of just scary? You can choose to live with it. Plenty of people do. You might know people who do. You might love people who live in filth and don't care. It's broken when I got here. Why does it matter? Or you can choose to clean it up. Cleaning it up's work, but it's really what's for the best. Francke drastically changed the slums. He had a Promethean and Sisyphean Christianity where he was just constantly working at making everything better regardless of the cost that it had to him. He was obsessed at eliminating all of these challenges that he faced. One of the very first things that he did was set up an orphanage to care for the young. The orphanage, by the way, and that system that Franke sets up becomes the model for orphanages throughout the 18th century, and including and expanded into the 19th century as well. New schools were also created in part to help the poor, but also the orphans that were at his schools. These schools emphasize self-denial, that you're not going to get everything you want, and charity towards their neighbor, that it's not all about you. You're going to say no to something, and that's important because that's going to help you advance and move forward. He will build hospitals and would help standardize medicine. The first widely disseminated medical manual in Germany and emergency care for most of Europe came out of the medical facilities that Franke was engaged in. If any of you are involved with the medical industry, it was impacted directly by Franke and what he did. In fact, the most profitable of the enterprises set up from Halle was the apothecary and the medicines that were then sent throughout the world, not just Germany, but we see examples of it in Russia as well as far off as India. Now, Franke was also a pastor and had religious ideas and would oftentimes send out missionaries along with these journeys, but he's also doing this well before the missionary movements of the 19th century. He's one of the first ones to really care for the souls of those who weren't around him. It wasn't just about confessional infighting, but really trying to spread the word of what he thought was important. He will also create his own press, known as the Poor People's Press. And he worked on eliminating the lewd behavior that surrounded Gloucester. In many ways, we can see the advances and challenges that Franke faced, a lot like those of New York in the second half of the 20th century. Right? New York in the 1970s was kind of a scary place. Early 2000s, it's got cleaned up. Now, some of us would like maybe a little grittier version of New York instead of the sort of spotless Disneyification that you're going to see under Rudy Giuliani, and definitely have some critiques of way some policing and other events happened. But the whole point of that reform was we're going to make everything look clean. Little things won't be scary. You're not going to throw something on the ground because there's already stuff on the ground, because there's not going to already be stuff on the ground. You're going to need to care for what's there. And this care for the neighbor and this charity towards those around you is really a part of the industriousness that Franke was working on. This is what he was wanting to be done. Now, again, there's a lot of things we would criticize Franke about. A lot of the people who he had working in his Poor People Press and his apothecary and his making of medicines and this, that, and the other were the orphans that he had laboring for him. Most of us look at this as an act of, horrible atrocity against the most vulnerable. At the time, it was seen as an act of charity. Today, we're like, that's not so great. But this constant work to try to make your life better and the lives of other people better as well. And he didn't force people into one thing or another. He just said, if you want this better way, you're going to kind of do what I say. And more or less, people went along with him because they saw the results. Franke transformed what Prussia was as a state. Now, the Hohenzollerns definitely had a part in it, and I don't want to minimize their contribution. But it was Franke and his school that formulated and created the Prussian ethos, the notion of Prussianism that many of us think of all of Germany with, came from Franke and this work. The country took on a new character, Prussianism. Before this, goods from Germany were kind of looked upon as laughable. The nickname for Germany throughout the 18th century was Sleeping Michael. Oh yeah, There's that German stuff. Might as well throw it away right now and save myself time. By the end of the 18th century, into the 19th century, this change takes place where most of us think of German goods as valuable and good. We don't look at it as junk that should be thrown away. There's precision, and there's expertise, and this is in part to what Franke did in his large legacy. Now, while you're being strict with a lot of the world around you, he also advises that you're a little strict with yourself, that you need to know what you're doing, and he would encourage you to guard your time. His home was a very busy place, as we would imagine, with a lot of tasks being done and a lot of people coming in and out, and he had a lot of rules in his house, a lot of rules that I wouldn't share in my own home. But one thing that he said is that he didn't like banter or idle dialogue or small talk, futile conversations. He said of himself, "I have not time to converse long enough with each of my visitors. I can truly say that when I devote an hour of my life to anyone, I feel that I have made him a large present. For an hour is worth more to me than much money." How much is your time worth? How much of your time is wasted with things that don't benefit you? How many of your hours are wasted on the phone or watching things that don't actually benefit your life? Now, I would criticize Franke again. I think there's a lot of little conversations that help build relationships. I think there's a lot of value out of a little horseplay and laughter. But this idea of, is this an investment in a larger conversation? Is this hopefully going to produce something nicer? Or is this just, wasting my time? There's something else you could do, right? This industrious nature. What else could you be doing to making your life better? And this is what Franke is asking us to consider. The last person we are going to talk about is Count Nicholas Ludwig von Ziesendorf. The Ziesendorfs were a very prominent family in the Holy Roman Empire. He grew up a count, which has some definite advantages. He also grew up a pietist and well connected within Pietism. His godfather was Spener. He attended schools hosted by Franke. He was well connected with all of this, even as a young lad. As a young lad, we also have some other stories about him and the idea that we need to be consistent with what we actually value. At the age of 6, the Swedes invaded Saxony, his home. They actually even invaded, literally, his home. And they ransacked his family's estate looking for supplies. The young count paid no mind to the invasion of his home, including his room. When the Swedes entered his room, what did they find the young lad doing? Praying, doing his devotionals. So this is what's important. I'm not hiding. I'm not running away. This is what my life is. This is what's important to me. The Swedes, who were also Lutheran, stopped and listened to him and admired what he said, and many of them even joined in with prayers. There's a couple other neat accounts of the young count being rather pious, but we see this sort of thing happening. He's asking people to be consistent with what they say they value and what they're actually doing. He continued this into his 20s. He then officially becomes a lawyer and is involved in public life in Dresden, and he's criticizing a lot of the Christian population who professed that they were indeed Christian and believed in Christ, but didn't resemble this in their confession. He ends up creating an anonymous weekly paper called the Dresden Socrates, where he's pointing out the inconsistency in these people's lives, that they profess one thing publicly, but not really when they're talking about their day-to-day life. Ziesendorf in the Dresden Socrates and other places asks a very basic question. Does your walk match your talk? Are you doing what you're saying is important to you? It's easy in many ways to put on a big game, but do you live up to your own standards? Do you even try? How often do you assess what you say you value in life and what it actually looks like you value in life? For example, stop right now, get out a piece of paper and a pencil. Now that you have a piece of paper and a pencil, and I mean it, go ahead and pause and go get that. It's going to be necessary. Actually, writing things down does have a massive effect. I want you to write down, you got it right? You good? I want you to write down the 5 most important things in your life. It doesn't necessarily have to be in order. If one of them's, kind of a tie with another, it's fine. But roughly, what are the 5 most important things in your life? What are the 5 things that you value most in your life? 1 thing is done. Go ahead and pause it until you've got it all figured out and written down. And maybe this takes a little while. Maybe this is also something you should do periodically in your life. Actually prioritize things and what is value. Then I want you to get another sheet of paper, or the back of that paper, or over to the side, or whatever. And I want you to write down what you spend most of your time doing in your life. The 5 things that you spend most of your time doing. Most of your time thinking about, worrying about. Maybe those aren't exactly the same, but maybe they are. Go ahead and roughly estimate how much of your time is spent on the things that are important as opposed to the things that are not. How consistent are those 2 lists? How much overlap is there? I'm sure there's some overlap between the most important things in your life and things that you spend a lot of time on. I'm sure there's certain obligations you're like, I didn't put work on there, but as the most important, but I have to be able to pay for my family to live, and that is on the list. And okay, so maybe we have a connection with that, right? But how many of those things that eat up your time on your list kind of shouldn't be so big on that time? A little bit here, a little bit there, yeah, there's value, but all of that time? If nothing else, we should venture to make the 5 most important things in our life have more of our time and more of our energy compared to those 5 least important things in our life. We should be pushing things one way instead of the other to try to be consistent, to try to let what we say we value be what we do. By the way, you'll probably find that life a little more fulfilling. Ziesendorf was kind of put in a similar challenge too, after criticizing everyone in Dresden in 1770 and 1722. A group of 10 persecuted Christians from Moravia sought aid. Ziesendorf gave these refugees some land to settle on, and really didn't intend on anything else as a result of this, or it becoming permanent. This group was commonly referred to as Moravians, because it consisted of some Moravians, but some Poles and Bohemians as well, and more started to gather. The small group became a middle group and a large group, and they chopped down trees and built things, and Ziesendorf saw it all and went, what do I do now? I thought I was being nice helping the refugees, and now they're literally taking over, and what do I value? Well, I value these people and these ideas, and they decided to name this settlement Herrnhut, or the Lord's Watch, and he takes this obstacle and he runs with it, because it's consistent with what he's valuing and what he sees. How do you handle unexpected obstacles, especially in relation to those things that you think you value? You say you value one thing if an obstacle, and it's hard, comes up, do you adapt, or do you say, yeah, I said I valued that, I really don't want to do that at all. That's really not going to make my life better. Ziesendorf didn't really want to set up a new community on his land, but he did. And in many ways, before too long, he became their leader. He's trying to be consistent with his values. He also was one of the very first to send out missionaries, and the Moravians were very important in that. Now, we're also not talking about the distant differences between Herrnhut and Herrnhag and the divisions between those and these communities that Ziesendorf sets up, and the apparent inconsistency that he gets during what's known as the sifting time and the craziness in those eras. But that's a story for another day. I've got a book if you'd like to read it, right? A little bit of discussion on that. But we want to try to be consistent most of our life with what we say we value. If we say we value something, we should be okay if somebody calls us on that. And if we don't, we don't. But again, this is the claim. This is what we're trying to do, and this is a way of making sure your priorities match up and will help you overcome the passions, because you've got this template to go back to and say, you know what? It wouldn't be consistent with who I am to do X, Y, and Z. We need to ask ourselves if what we've addressed is really a religious system, or is it just an ethical one? I mean, in many ways, we've been talking about church stuff and groups over there and experiencing God, and that's clearly a religious idea, but it contains a lot of ideas of an ethical system as well. Trying to be consistent with what you do and work hard, and all of those good ideas seem like they would fit in within any broad ethical discussion. But what areas are we lacking in calling this a ethical system as opposed to a religious system? What qualities of a religious system do we clearly see, or is it just the fact that God is tacked in on this and that you're trying to experience God or do these things for God? Is that essential, or is that just kind of along for the ride? What qualities do we think that it lacks of a religious system, broadly speaking? And again, we only briefly touched in on this, so we might not have a fuller discussion on this as we would for some other ones. And do you really think that this is more an ethical or a religious system? Is it both, or is it neither? We should also ask ourselves what this system has told us about what is ethical. Probably a little more clear in this discussion than we've had with some of the other ones, and maybe what constitutes a good life. Maybe what are the passions? How would we identify the passions by addressing what Franke and Ziesendorf and the others have done? Is it different between Spener and Arndt and Perkins? Or is the passions all roughly the same thing from what we've discussed and the reading that you had out of other things as well? Or is it all about how you overcome the passions? And maybe they don't identify what they are for you, but they tell you maybe some techniques in overcoming them. Again, today's discussion about this was a little bit different. We approached it with a little more of highlighting some of the major takeaways, and it didn't get into some of the nuance that we did with some of the other ones, but hopefully you gleaned a few of these things on how you should overcome the passions in your own life, and possibly also even why you should overcome these passions. We should ask ourselves how this system can help us today answer these big questions. How it can affect the struggles that exist all around us and those ethical debates that are affecting you today. And you know what these are because they're affecting you. Maybe they're broader cultural ones. Maybe they're grandiose issues, and maybe they're personal. But how does Pietism address this for you? hopefully there's a handful of takeaways that you can get from this one, and we can address that moving forward.